This video will provide an overview of MDE's TMDL implementation progress and planning tool, which was developed to provide a simpler, transparent way of measuring and reporting local nutrient and sediment TMDL implementation progress and future plans. The tool is spreadsheet-based and compatible even with early versions of Excel. This video will focus on how to set up and use the tool rather than its development. First, I'll walk through an unedited version of the tool and then show an example with sample watershed and BMP information. When first opening the spreadsheet, a pop-up box will appear asking if you want to disable macros before opening the file, as shown here. This tool uses macros to allow users to add rows to existing data tables, so we do recommend enabling macros. However, be aware that if you choose not to do so, the add row buttons provided will not work. We recommend that new users of the spreadsheet spend time reading through all of the information on the README tab, which will hopefully clear up any confusion right off the bat and provide the foundational knowledge to begin using the tool quickly. At the top of this tab, you'll find the tool's version date. Please double check to ensure that you are using the most up-to-date version of the tool. It can be found here. The first section of the README, titled About the Calculator, outlines the tool's basic developmental characteristics, where input data has been pulled from, and describes how to read cell formatting. At the bottom of this list, here, you'll find contact information if you have any questions or need help troubleshooting. The next section of the README is titled Using the Calculator. This section describes the tool's tabs and contains general information about the sections within each tab. The spreadsheet contains 9 tabs total, not including the README. The Summary tab, Baseline Year tab, Current Progress tab, and Implementation Scenario tab are where you'll be inputting your watershed and BMP information. The other 5 tabs are for reference and contain the general watershed and BMP information the tool needs to function. These tabs are protected, so that information cannot be changed accidentally. If this information needs to be updated, MDE will release an updated version of the tool. Under Calculator section, here, you'll find a breakdown of how the Baseline Year, Current Progress, and Implementation Scenario tabs are split with the exception of Land Use, which is only found in the Baseline Year tab. Otherwise, each Scenario tab includes a section for septic BMPs, the various alternative BMPs, and stormwater management BMPs. The third section of the README tab is titled Cast Components of Load Sources used in this spreadsheet. This section outlines the cast components of load sources used in the spreadsheet, or how they were derived if not taken directly from cast. The fourth and last section of this tab is titled Equations used in this spreadsheet. This section outlines the formulas used to calculate the various land use loads and load reductions for each BMP type. Next, we'll move on to the Summary tab. In this tab, you'll input your basic project information. And please note that all cells in this section are required in order for the tool to return results. First, you'll input the name of your implementation plan, your 8-digit watershed, here you have a drop-down, the county you're working in, here you have another drop-down, and your baseline year, reduction percentage, and the impairment that you're looking at, whether it's TN, TP, or TSS. And just for your information, an easy place to find baseline year and reduction percentage information is using the WLA search function in the TMDL data center. Next, you'll indicate if you're using specific land use information, and that just means that you have impervious road and impervious non-road data. If you have only aggregate impervious data, that means you have general land use information, and you would keep this as no. There is a note here, and also more information about this is included in the README tab, but specific land use information can be found using reclassified land cover data provided by MDE. If and when a jurisdiction needs to backcast data in order to match a TMDL baseline, MDE has also reviewed and approved a method used by Baltimore County, and that is located in the TMDL data center. These next sections are summaries for the outputs of the next couple tabs. So here you have your baseline load summary, and that summarizes your baseline land use information as well as your BMP inputs. You have the same for the current progress tab, summarizes your BMP inputs, and then brings down your baseline information just for easy comparison. And next, your implementation scenario summary brings down your current progress output for easy comparison, and then your BMP information that you input. In this BMP units section, this is just a summary of the BMP units that you've input in the baseline current progress implementation tab, and that is separated by whether it's a septic BMP, shoreline management, stream restoration, street sweeping, storm drain cleaning, urban nutrient management, land use conversion, or stormwater management BMP. So this is just a quick snapshot of all the BMP units that you have input into this spreadsheet. And lastly, you have your overall plan summary for the specified pollutant. Here you can indicate whether or not you want to look at edge of stream or edge of tide loads. And this summarizes your impairment baseline load, the target load that you're hoping to achieve based on the reduction percentage that you input, the total reduction that you need to achieve in order to meet your percent reduction, and then here you have your total progress that you've achieved based on BMPs that you input into the current progress tab. It calculates a progress percent reduction for you to see how on track you are for meeting your percent reduction. And in the implementation scenario, same as the progress, it calculates the total load that you have after you've implemented all of the BMPs that you've input in your implementation scenario tab, and then calculates an implementation percent reduction. So ultimately, you'd want your implementation percent reduction to either reach the percent reduction goal that you set in the basic project information section here, or exceed it. And next, we'll move on to the baseline year tab. At the top of the baseline year tab, we have a summary section, which provides a quick snapshot of what this tab is outputting. So you have your baseline edge of stream load, your baseline edge of tide load. And in the current progress and implementation scenario tabs, you'll be seeing something similar as well. Next, we have our land use section. Here you'll be inputting your baseline year land use information. And as you can see, the impervious road and impervious non-road cells have been grayed out. And that's because in the summary tab, we chose that we were not using specific land use information. If we had chosen yes, then the aggregate impervious cell would have been grayed. This is just some cell formatting just so that users don't get confused and input more information than they need, and that they input the information they have in the correct cells. Next, you have your septic BMP section. Please note, as it's noted here in bold, that the addition of septic loads is optional. So MDE is not requiring MS4s to include septic system loads in the TMDL reduction requirements. That's because many TMDLs do not explicitly account for septic loads, and therefore they are implicitly captured by the urban stormwater load. MDE recognizes that opportunities may exist for jurisdictions to achieve more efficient load reductions via septic BMPs rather than urban stormwater BMPs. And so the department does not want to create a roadblock to achieving enhanced efficiency. So if you do decide to include septic BMPs in your implementation plans, please input them in this section. So here you have a drop down of septic BMPs, and then you would input the number of systems that particular practice applies to, and you would get edge of stream load reduction and edge of tide load reduction. It's basically the same format for the rest of the BMP types. So next, we have an alternative BMP section. The first two BMP types that we have here are shoreline management and stream restoration. Both have a type dropdown where you would indicate whether or not you're using default planning rates or manually inputting the load reductions. We note here that it is recommended that shoreline management and stream restoration load reductions be entered manually. However, default planning rates are available for planning purposes. Please use the protocol methods outlined in the expert panels approved by CBP to determine load reductions outside of this tool. To make things easier, MDE has developed a shoreline management and stream restoration protocol calculator, and those should be available on the website soon. Next, we have street sweeping. Again, you would choose the BMP and then input the lane miles that the practice applies to. Storm drain cleaning, you choose the type of material that you collected, whether or not you're using default enrichment factors. If no, then you have these spaces to input TN and TP enrichment factors, and then you would input the pounds collected. Next, you have urban nutrient management. Again, choosing the practice from the drop-down. Here you would indicate whether or not the Fertilizer Act applies to the practice. And in general, as we state here, the Fertilizer Act applies to all practices implemented after 2014. And then you would just input the treated turf that the practice applies to. Next, we have land use conversion BMPs. You would indicate what you're converting from and what you're converting to, and then the acres treated or acres converted. Next, we have our stormwater management BMP section. Again, choose the practice you're implementing, and if you've chosen stormwater treatment or runoff reduction, you can input the PE treated. Indicate whether or not a floating treatment wetland is a part of the practice. So if not, then we have no, and then if yes, you have the floating treatment wetland practices to choose from. And then again, input the treated acreage. Here you can see that the impervious road and impervious non-road has been grayed out, just like you saw for the land use information section. And again, that is because we chose that we were not using specific land use information. Before we move on, I'll also mention that we do have add row buttons for the land use conversion BMP section and stormwater management BMP section. So if you do need more cells added or bigger tables because you have more BMPs than 10, you can click this button and it can add rows for you. Next, move on to the current progress section tab. The first thing that you do in this tab would be to input the current year that this current progress tab applies to. So say for example, it's 2021, but you've only implemented BMPs up until 2020. So the current year for this current progress tab would be 2020. Next, you have your summary section, which is similar to what I showed you in the baseline year tab. It summarizes the total edge of stream load reduction and total edge of tide load reduction that you receive based on what you've input into this current progress tab. Next, you have your septic BMP section, your alternative BMP section, your land use conversion BMP section, and the stormwater management BMP section. Again, all similar to the previous tab I just showed you. And next, we have our implementation scenario tab. This tab is a little bit different. The summary table, as you can see, is larger, and that's because it's split into 3 different scenarios. So this tab provides you with a milestone 1 scenario, a milestone 2 scenario, and a planned scenario that you can use for planning purposes. Before you begin planning with these scenarios, we recommend that you define each milestone designation just so you don't forget. So for example, milestone 1, if your ultimate goal will be reached in 2025, milestone 1 could be 2022, milestone 2 could be 2023, and then planned would be 2025. So that's up until you reach your percent reduction goal. Next, you have your septic BMP section. The only difference here from the previous two tabs is that you would indicate what scenario the practice you're inputting is going to be applied to, so whether milestone 1, milestone 2, or planned. The alternative BMP section, and land use conversion BMP section, and then lastly your stormwater management BMP section. Now moving on to our reference tabs. First we have our efficiency BMP information tab, where you'll find the BMP short names, the BMP full names, and their associated reduction efficiency percentages. We have our TN loading rate tab, split by county and Maryland 8-digit. You'll see the same formatting for the TP loading rate tab and the TSS loading rate tab. And lastly, we have our delivery factor tab, which we use to calculate the edge of tide loads. And now we're going to go through the demo portion of this video. So this is the same spreadsheet that we just walked through, except I've pre-populated Port Tobacco TSS implementation plan information. So first I've input my name of the implementation plan, chosen the 8-digit watershed that I'm working in, the county, the baseline year of my TMDL, the reduction percentage that I'm shooting for, and the impairment. I've also indicated that I will not be using specific land use information, so that means that I don't have impervious road and impervious non-road data. And we'll revisit the rest of what's on this tab later. Next, moving on to baseline year, I've input my land use for my baseline, aggregate impervious and turf. I have no septic BMPs. For alternative BMPs, I have one urban nutrient management plan, and the Fertilizer Act does not apply. And I've input the treated turf. And then we just have a list of our baseline stormwater management BMPs here. Next, for current progress, you can see that I've already input the current year, which is 2020. So all of the BMPs that I input on this tab correspond to 2020. Everything in this tab represents above and beyond the baseline. So here we can see that I have a storm drain cleaning BMP, collecting organic material using default nutrient enrichment factors. I have another urban nutrient management plan, except here you can see that I've input a negative amount. So negative BMP amounts can account for changes in treated amounts between each scenario, like you see here. It's a difference between the baseline and current progress scenario, or specifically for stormwater management BMPs, the negative amount could correspond to a BMP conversion. And in that case, you would input the negative amount of the BMP being converted and a positive amount for what that BMP is being converted to. And then you can see that we've input several land use conversion BMPs, and for the current progress scenario, we have no stormwater management BMPs. Next, for the implementation scenario, you can see that I've designated milestone 1 as 2023, and the planned scenario is 2025. So everything that's outputting here corresponds to BMPs that I plan to implement by 2023, and everything here are BMPs that I plan to implement by 2025. So for this scenario, I have 2 stream restoration BMPs, one for my milestone 1 scenario and one for my planned. One of these I've manually input my load reduction, and then one I'm using the default planning rates. For storm drain cleaning, this is another example of when I've input a negative amount. And for land use conversion BMPs, I have 2 here. One of them again has a negative amount. and then stormwater management BMPs. And here, just like I mentioned before in the current progress scenario, in this instance, with this negative amount, this can potentially correspond to a BMP that's being converted from, for example, a dry pond into something else. Now that we've input all of our BMPs, we can go back to the Summary tab and scroll down to see if we've met our percent reduction goal. So right here we can see that we're at 33.47% and our goal is 34. So we have not quite reached it. So going back to the implementation scenario, let's add a tree planting BMP. So we'll go turf to forest and we'll add 100 acres. Then we'll go back to our Summary tab and see that now we're at 34.37% and we've reached that 34% reduction goal. So that's it for the demo. If you still have questions or need help troubleshooting, feel free to reach out to the contact listed in the README or check out the FAQ that's also available on the MDE website.